Intro.
Let's begin.
1991 saw the release of the animated film Beauty and the Beast, one of the most critically acclaimed and beloved films in Disney history. Like most of Disney's movies, it was adapted from a tale as old as time, in this case a French story from the 1700s with some key differences. Belle, the beauty in this story, and the Beast, aka Prince Adam, managed to overcome their differences, fall in love, and live happily ever after. Beauty and the Beast teaches you that who a person is on the inside is what matters most. Actions are what counts, not appearances, because looks can be deceiving. A hideous and hated beast can actually be hiding a kind and caring nature, while a beloved brute might actually be the true beast after all.
He's no monster, Gaston. You are.
Humility, perception, forgiveness. Some of the themes central to the story of Beauty and the Beast. However, what if that's wrong? What if Beauty and the Beast isn't about being kind and looking within? What if Beauty and the Beast is about Stockholm Syndrome? Yeah, let's get rid of those more meaningful and relevant themes and make this about something else, because that's what kids care about, pop psychology. Belle didn't fall in love with the Beast. No, her story is really about trauma.
The movie is about trauma.
This isn't love, this is mental illness. Children shouldn't learn from this movie. Belle had no agency, Belle had no power. Belle was imprisoned by the Beast. La Bête. I don't know French. I failed French. In fact, I hate the French.
A joke?
Belle was a prisoner. Prisoners, captives, hostages, typically, they can't leave the place where they're being held. They can't just walk out. If their captor does allow them freedom, it's usually given under strict circumstances, and there's a threat that always remains. Come back or else. Hey, remember that part in the movie where Belle feels the Beast's behavior has gone too far and she just leaves?
Where are you going?
Promise or no promise, I can't stay here another minute.
When you realize Belle had more independence than the Stockholm Theory allows, you realize just how much the theory undermines what actually happens in the story. Having recently rewatched Beauty and the Beast, I can report that the people who believe Belle had Stockholm Syndrome completely misinterpreted the movie, because the movie tells you what it's all about within the first few minutes. The whole Stockholm Syndrome theory is just wrong and bad, but people misinterpret fictional stories all the time. It's not a crime. Yet.
Off with his head! Off with his head! Off with his head!
Oh, I just can't wait to be king. While we are on the subject, you know who else wrote an adaptation of Beauty and the Beast? George R.R. Martin. Whoa. When he was a young lad writing in Hollywood back in 1987, he worked on a show that was a modern-day retelling of Beauty and the Beast. The cast of the show was pretty stacked. It featured Linda Hamilton as the beauty of the story and Ron Perlman as the Beast. And also, get this, Roy Dotrice, the narrator of the A Song of Ice and Fire audiobooks. It's a shame he died before The Winds of Winter ever came out. I mean, we all will, probably. None of the episodes of the show deal with Stockholm Syndrome, but what about those fantasy books Martin would later go on to write? Martin does use the Beauty and the Beast pairing in A Song of Ice and Fire. We see this with the characters of Sansa Stark and the Hound, Brienne of Tarth and Jaime Lannister, and Theon Greyjoy and Ned Stark.
Theon Greyjoy.
Theon grew up as Ned Stark's ward and hostage. He was taken from his family as a way to prevent his father Balon from starting yet another rebellion. Despite growing up in Winterfell, never knowing if one day Ned might have to kill him, Theon would later confess not only did he love the Starks, he wanted to be one. How could that be if he grew up as their captive? Could it be that Theon Greyjoy has Stockholm Syndrome? No. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, please like, subscribe, and give me your money. Okay, fine. I guess I'll do my job.
Hey, didn't Lindsay Ellis already make that joke?
Be quiet or he'll hear you. No, Theon Greyjoy does not have Stockholm Syndrome. Him professing his love of the Starks was not the result of some long-enduring mental trauma.
It's a movie about trauma.
It was love, real love, and in this video, I will explain the reasons why I think so. And even though this video was meant to solely be about the case of Theon Greyjoy, I felt it would be remiss if I didn't talk about two other characters who followed the Beauty and the Beast pairing. That's right, you guessed it, Daenerys Targaryen and Khal Drogo. Yeah, while writing the script for this video, I realized I couldn't talk about Stockholm Syndrome and not mention Daenerys. But this will be fine. Nothing weird ever happens when you make video essays about Daenerys Targaryen. People on the internet are totally normal when it comes to Dany. Hills Alive criticized Dany.
Mother.
In A Game of Thrones, Daenerys is forcefully wed to Khal Drogo, a Dothraki warlord and slaver. At the beginning of their marriage, Drogo forcefully takes Dany in bed, yet over the course of the book, Daenerys comes to love Khal Drogo. He's her sun and stars, and she is the moon of his life. By the end of the book, she is even willing to give her life for him. How could this be if she never wanted to wed him in the first place? How could this be if at the start of their marriage he was violently assaulting her? Could it be that Daenerys Targaryen has Stockholm Syndrome? No. Let's get into it. Do Theon Greyjoy and Daenerys Targaryen have Stockholm Syndrome? You know, I'm kind of taking it for granted that people watching this know exactly what Stockholm Syndrome is. I should probably explain it so we're all on the same page. To do that, I first have to tell you a story about this really funny thing that happened one day in Stockholm, Sweden. Chapter 1. The really funny thing that happened one day in Stockholm, Sweden. It was on the 23rd of August, 1973, that a gunman walked into a credit bank in Stockholm, Sweden. His name was Jan Erik Olsson. Write this down. This will be important later. He took 4 of the bank employees hostage, 3 women and 1 man. He, along with an accomplice, would hold the hostages for the next 5 days, while the police made desperate attempts to free them. At one point, a hole was drilled into the ceiling of the vault where the criminals and hostages were holding out. The police used that hole to take this picture. One of the criminals used that same hole to shoot one of the officers in the face. It all ended on the 28th when the police managed to inject tear gas into the vault to flush out the criminals and their hostages. The hostages were taken to safety, the criminals apprehended, and the day was saved. Now, you would think after all of this was over, the hostages would be grateful that law enforcement managed to rescue them without any of them being seriously hurt. Situations like this have ended worse. Way, way worse. Like the Moscow theater hostage crisis. In that case, Chechen terrorists took a theater full of people hostage. In order to save the hostages, law enforcement authorities decided to flood the theater with poison gas. Because, as we all well know, poison only works on bad people. You can guess what happened next. RIP. But in any case, if you thought the Stockholm hostages would be grateful they were rescued by police, you'd be wrong. Because after the hostages left the bank vault, they only had one thing to say.
Playing Fuck the Police by NWA.
The former hostages heavily criticized the police once they were free. One former hostage, Kristen Inmark, was extremely hostile in the aftermath. But oddly enough, these former hostages had nothing but nice things to say about their captors. Initially, they refused to testify against them in court. Kristen Inmark even reunited with one of her captors once he was released from prison. Victims speaking out in defense of those that victimized them. It was seen as very unusual at the time. This bizarre behavior was noted by Swedish criminologist Niels Bejerot. He believed Kristen Inmark in specific was suffering from some sort of newfound mental illness, a syndrome which he would call... I'm not even going to try to say this. I feel like if I did, I would summon something, like something bad would happen to my black ass. Bejerot called it normal story, named after the location where the incident took place. It later became known as Stockholm Syndrome. On the outset, Stockholm Syndrome is a theory that tried to explain why hostages sometimes developed psychological bonds with their captors. The curious case of Patty Hearst is often used as another example of the syndrome. In 1974, Hearst was a young woman with rich, well-connected relatives when she was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. After spending weeks as a hostage, Hearst announced to authorities she had joined the Symbiote Liberation Army and changed her name to Tania. This is a picture of Patty as Tania. She's robbing a bank with her captors. Patty Hearst said she was kept in a closet for weeks during her captivity, and she could overhear her captors discussing killing her at times. They'd let her out for meals and to join in on political discussions, but that was the extent of her freedom. Honestly, I'd say yes to the meals and no to the political discussions. Just keep me in the closet.
Don't you think it's a little too late for that?
But once they were done with their chats, she would get chucked back into the closet. Yet after all that, the mistreatment, the possibility of being murdered, she still decided to join the Symbionese Liberation Army. Did she get syndromed? The term Stockholm Syndrome has since leapt out of the realm of pop psychology into the realm of pop culture. From Ann Darrow in King Kong to Evie Hammond in V for Vendetta, a lot of fictional characters have been diagnosed with Stockholm Syndrome. One of the most famous examples being Belle from Beauty and the Beast, which we've already talked about. The complexity of these characters, the things that motivate them, the very basic plot of the stories they are in are straight up ignored. Instead, the reason these characters do the things that they do and the reason the plot plays out as it does is because they got syndromed. Even A Song of Ice and Fire characters aren't safe from these armchair psychologists either, which brings us back to Theon Greyjoy and Daenerys Targaryen. There are several key components that go into the development of Stockholm Syndrome, so we are told. They are: hostage develops positive feelings toward their captor. There is no previous hostage-captor relationship. The hostage has an increasing belief in the humanity of their captor. The hostage learns to excuse abusive behaviors of their captor. And finally, a refusal by the hostage to accept the support of authorities. These components can also include a refusal by the hostage to cooperate with police and other government authorities, and a hostage's belief in the humanity of the captor, ceasing to perceive them as a threat when the victim holds the same values as the aggressor. But we're going to stick to the first 5 for the sake of simplicity. Lindsay Ellis also listed these components in her video on Beauty and the Beast. It's hard to talk about Stockholm Syndrome without going over the same things she did actually. I just hope I've been transformative enough to not summon him. Not all of these things are needed for Stockholm Syndrome to develop. These are just some of the common denominators in alleged cases of Stockholm Syndrome. To know for sure if someone or a character in a book has Stockholm Syndrome, we must needs check to see if they display any of the symptoms. I will analyze one character first, then move on to the next. I'll start with Theon Greyjoy first, but you can skip ahead to Daenerys if you like. I know that's why you're here. I can see it in your face. Chapter 2. The Symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, Theon Greyjoy Edition. Symptom number 1. A severely uneven power relationship in which the captor dictates what the prisoner can and cannot do. As Lord Eddard's ward and hostage, Theon had less power than Eddard, but did Ned actually dictate what Theon could and could not do? No. Well, no more than he did his own children, I would imagine. There's that part in Beauty and the Beast where the Beast is laying down the ground rules of the manor to Belle. We never see or hear of such a scene with Theon. I'm sure he was told about the rules of Winterfell when he first arrived, but I'm sure any long-term guest I'm sure any long-term guest is usually given a rundown of the rules when they are staying someplace long-term. When Theon thinks back on his life with the Starks, we are never told, and it is never implied, Theon is given a set of instructions that determined what he was allowed to do or not to do, that his movements about the castle were different from everyone else's. We are given the impression Theon was raised right alongside the Stark children. In fact, during the feast welcoming King Robert to the north, his social status as a true-born Greyjoy meant he could attend and take part in the formalities of the feast, whereas Jon, who is considered a Stark bastard, could not. He was sat in the back of the hall. When highborns are held as hostages, they are treated with the courtesy that befits their status. Theon was more than a hostage, though. He was a ward. Basically, he was Ned Stark's foster child. In his youth, Ned was a ward of Jon Arryn. He loved that man like a second father. It makes sense Ned would try to treat Theon with the same fatherly affection he experienced with Jon Arryn. Theon and the Stark boys were raised as brothers. Theon says as much to his Lord Father Baelon, which pisses Baelon off.
Oh, not here, not in my hearing. You will not name him brother. This son of the man who put your true brothers to the sword.
This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 2. The captive is held under threat of death or physical injury at the hands of the captor. Yes, Theon was a hostage. He was to be killed if his father ever rebelled again. The threat of death was always there. There have been arguments made that Ned would never harm an innocent child. Ned often speaks out in defense of innocent children being put into danger. But I don't think the question, would Ned hurt Theon, really matters in this case. What matters is, did Theon fear the risk of death? The answer is yes. This symptom does apply. But hang on, we're not done yet. Symptom number 3, the inability of the captive to engage in behaviors that may assist in their release or detachment. As a ward and hostage of Eddard Stark, no, Theon was not able to do anything that might result in his release. However, Ned Stark famously dies in Book 1. Afterwards, his son Robb Stark takes his place as Lord. Theon then becomes his hostage. We know this because Catelyn begs Robb to keep Theon close in Book 2. She wants to maintain his hostagehood. This is difficult for her to do because Theon and Robb grew up as brothers, and homies don't keep their homies hostage. Against his mother's wishes, Robb decides to send Theon back to Pike to meet with his father Baelon and to present Lord Baelon with Robb's plan for an alliance. Now here's the important thing. Theon was supposed to deliver the message and then Theon was supposed to come back. He did not. You would think if Theon had Stockholm Syndrome for the family that held him hostage that he wouldn't be so eager to sail back home. Once Theon had the opportunity to leave, he left. Theon dipped. This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 4. The smallest act of kindness or lack of violence from the captor elicits feelings of sympathy from the captive. This is the part where the captor starts being a little nice to their captive. If the captive is being starved, the captor might bring them a meal. If they are wearing rags, the captor might bring them new clothes. If the captive is abusive, then the abuse might start to decrease in severity or stop altogether. These small things get the captive to think their captor might not be so bad after all. This doesn't happen with Theon because Theon was never abused or otherwise mistreated. There is one vivid memory Theon has, and it's the time he got a beating. Theon calls it a thrashing, but presumably he's talking about a very memorable spanking. I don't personally believe in spanking or thrashing kids, but the characters in this world do, cause that's how this world works. People get beheaded, kids get thrashed, people are forced into marriages.
Where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home.
If there's any consolation, Theon didn't get thrashed for no reason. He got thrashed because he knocked over old Nan while running down some stairs. She's, well, old. She could have died. Falls are dangerous for old people. Besides, running around and knocking over people is bad behavior for anyone, highborn or not. Theon didn't get thrashed because he was a hostage. He got a spanking for doing something bad. Now when Theon thinks back to his time on Pike with his brothers, he remembers they beat him worse than any thrashing he received at Winterfell. Theon makes this comparison during a point where he realizes his life was not so bad with the Starks. He betrayed the Starks for the Greyjoys when the Starks had treated him much better. Theon was never abused by Ned or any of the Starks. Ned takes on a paternal role for Theon, one that Baelon never did. This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 5, a self-preservation instinct on the part of the prisoner. The victim learns to avoid triggers that will set off the captor. This means that during the time the captive has endured abuse at the hands of their captor, they've learned the moods of their captor and are able to anticipate their actions. They do this in an attempt to lessen the abuse they experience. For example, if their captor is talkative, then that means the captive can be talkative too. They might even have conversations together. But if their captor is silent, then the captive has learned they must be silent too, because in the past, when their captor was silent and they were talkative, they suffered abuse. Theon never goes through this, neither with Ned or with Robb or with any other Stark. He doesn't do this because Theon was never abused by the Starks. Theon does learn to walk on eggshells when he is with Ramsay Snow, however. Quote, "And what do you want, my sweet reek?" Ramsay murmured, as softly as a lover. His breath smelled of mulled wine and cloves, so sweet. Such valiant service deserves a reward. I cannot give you back your fingers or your toes, but surely there is something you would have of me. Shall I have you free instead? Release you from my service? Do you want to go with them? Return to your bleak isles in the cold grey sea? Be a prince again? Or would you sooner stay my leal serving man? A cold knife scraped along his spine. Be careful, he told himself. Be very, very careful. He did not like his lordship's smile, the way his eyes were shining, the spittle glistening at the corner of his mouth. He had seen such signs before. You are no prince. Your reek, just reek. It rhymes with freak. Give him the answer that he wants. End quote. There is a difference between Theon being Ned's hostage and Theon being Ramsay's hostage. A stark difference.
Oh, brother!
This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 6. Negative feelings by the victim towards family, friends, or authorities trying to help or support the victim.
It's me, Yara.
You can't trick me. You can trick me.
I'm not tricking you, Theon. I'm saving you.
Theon. My name is Reed. No, you can't. You can't.
You're Theon Greyjoy.
This might actually be the closest we will get to seeing Theon Greyjoy have Stockholm Syndrome, and this doesn't even happen in the books. Asha and Ramsay never do battle. Well, at least they got Ramsay's fighting style right. He does look like a butcher chopping meat. Theon does have negative feelings towards his family, but it's not because they're supportive of him and he is determined to stay with his abuser. It's almost the exact opposite.
Your time with the wolves has made you weak.
You act as if I volunteered to go. You gave me away, if you remember. The day you bent the knee to Robert Baratheon. After he crushed you. Did you take what was yours then? You gave me away! Your boy! Your last boy! You gave me away like I was some dog you didn't want anymore! And now you curse me because I've come home!
I know this is a scene from the show, but it does capture how Theon feels about his family versus the Starks. Theon wanted to come home. He wanted to be accepted. Balon and the other Greyjoys rejected him. They treat Theon like an inconvenience, someone they can't trust. They would rather he go back to the Starks. This symptom does not apply. We ran down the list and only one of the 6 symptoms fits Theon Greyjoy. I think it's safe to say that Theon Greyjoy does not have Stockholm Syndrome. But if Theon's story isn't about a young man that has developed Stockholm Syndrome for the family that held him hostage, what's his story all about then? Chapter 3. What is Theon's story all about then? The answer to this question is simple.
Is ethics something that intrigues you?
Yes, I ethics, morality, the whole question of right and wrong, of heroism and villainy. These are all issues. I mean, I've always taken as my writing mantra what William Faulkner said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself, and I believe that. And that's what you see in Game of Thrones, and hopefully in many of my other earlier works as well.
Theon Greyjoy is a man torn between 2 identities. For half his life, he was raised in Ironborn, a Greyjoy of Pike, the son of the Lord Reaper, one of the heirs to the Seastone chair. For the other half, he was born as the ward and hostage of Eddard Stark. The heir to an ancient house has become a political pawn for another ancient house. There has to be great shame in that. Life has made a jape of him. How does he cope with this? By smiling. Always smiling. Theon smiles because the joke isn't on him. The joke is on everyone else. Everyone might think his situation is a joke now, but in the end, he'll have the last laugh.
Well, there'll come a day when I'll show all of you!
Theon believed one day his dilemma would be over. He would be a Lord's son again, and he would go down in history as a great man. Being a hostage would be just a small part of his history, not his whole story. He believed that once he came into power, no one would ever remember that shameful portion of his life, and if they did dare to mention it, he would make them regret it. Yes, Theon's story was also about plotting and planning revenge. This is a goal he planned to accomplish by any means necessary. He was even willing to betray the Starks, his foster family, to achieve that end.
Theon, did you hate us the whole time?
This is another show-only moment, but one of the really good ones. For one, it shows Bran was very intelligent for his age, keenly observant. The show used to do that often in earlier seasons.
Family, duty, honor.
Those are Tully words, your mother's.
Family comes first.
Your mother had to leave Winterfell to protect the family.
How can she protect the family if she's not with her family?
See? Bran used to be so clever, and then Bran became a tree.
My brother died for you. Hodor and Summer died for you. I almost died for you.
For two, this exchange also cuts right to the center of things. Did Theon hate the Starks the whole time? No, he did not. Theon may have resented them, but he did not hate them. Theon chafed at the invisible noose around his neck. He lived trembling under the shadow of the sword that hung above him, never knowing the day when it might come swinging down. This caused him to resent Ned. Theon also harbored jealousy towards Robb because Robb was everything Theon was in another life. Robb got to be his father's son. Robb felt his father's love. Robb became Lord. 7 hells, he even became a king. And what did Theon get? He got to stand by his side as his friend and his hostage. How does one reconcile with that? Your best friend, your brother in all but blood, is being covered in glory. You're his closest confidant, yet you're his prisoner. And there may come a day he has to strike your head off, all for a crime you did not commit. Ned Stark might have been dead, but the noose around Theon's neck was still there. Now it's his son holding the other end. Not even Grey Wind bore such a leash. And yet, Theon still loved Robb and all the rest of the Starks. Eddard was more fatherly to Theon than Balon ever was. Robb was more of a brother than any of Theon's true-born brothers. Sure, Jon was broody, and the little ones, Bran and Rickon, were annoying. Arya was always underfoot, and Sansa haughty, but that is the way of siblings. Theon had genuine reasons for being angry with Ned, and it's completely understandable why he would have harbored negative feelings toward Robb. He resented Ned and Robb, but he also loved them. Theon can resent the Starks, but he can also love them. As Jojen Reed would say, if ice can burn, then love and hate can mate. He loved the Starks and wanted to be one, but he also wanted to be a Greyjoy, his Lord Father's heir. But that role was lost to him a long time ago, and he could never truly get it back. Balon had already removed Theon from his own heart, replacing him with Asha. Balon calls Asha his son. In fact, Balon called his banners way before Theon arrived back in Pike. Balon was prepared to launch his fleet without his son. Going to war, starting another rebellion, meant Theon would be executed. He forfeited Theon's life. He dismissed him as a Stark. By betraying the Starks and taking Winterfell, Theon was trying to gain the approval of a man who had already deemed him dead. Yet he still tried. Theon was torn between Stark or Greyjoy. Where does he place his loyalty? The human heart in conflict with itself. Now isn't that a better story than Theon got syndromed? So then, Theon Greyjoy does not have Stockholm Syndrome. That was easy to explain. But now that brings us to the other one. Here we go. Chapter 4, The Symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, Daenerys Targaryen edition. Symptom number 1, a severely uneven power relationship in which the captor dictates what the prisoner can and cannot do. Daenerys was not Drogo's captive, his prisoner, or his hostage. She was his wife. This symptom does not apply.
And, yeah, that's really about it. So, yep.
There are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to Dany's relationship with Drogo, so bear island with me as I go through this. Dany did not want to be in this marriage, but the same thing can be said for a lot of other characters in this story. She's not unique in that regard. The text says her brother sold her to Khal Drogo for an army. And Hoster Tully sold his daughter Lysa to Jon Arryn for an army. Quote, Lysa was the price Jon Arryn had to pay for the swords and spears of House Tully. End quote. Calling Lysa the price sounds transactional to me. Did Jon Arryn literally pay for Lysa Arryn? Was Lysa Arryn human property?
Nope.
This is not hard to understand. Dany and Lysa were both sold for armies. Both had their babies killed in their wombs by deception. Both had people flocking to them to take advantage of the power they possessed. Why aren't we comparing them instead of saying, well, actually no, Dany had it worse. She was a child bride and sold to a slaver, pedophile, rapist. What is the point of this? Is this what counts for analysis? Blunt, brutal misinterpretations of the text? Disappointing. The power between Dany and Drogo was imbalanced, just so. But again, this is true for many of the marriages in this story. The spouse of every noble is also their subject. They are expected to follow any orders given by that noble. Spouses and other relatives have more wiggle room than your average subject, of course, but the expectation of obedience is still there.
Aemond, look at me. Your king demands an answer.
Drogo was a Dothraki Khal, a king. There's going to be a power imbalance in a marriage when one spouse wields absolute power. Dany and Drogo was the equivalent of a royal marriage, Khal and Khaleesi, king and queen. Unless, of course, you disagree and believe their union wasn't your usual arranged marriage. Because Daenerys was sold to Khal Drogo, a slaver, that means she was his slave. A sex slave, in fact. Daenerys Targaryen was never a literal slave. George R.R. Martin spoke out against the writers of Game of Thrones because they changed Daenerys and Drogo's wedding night to include sexual assault, something that doesn't happen in the books. Quote, why did the wedding scene change from the consensual seduction scene to the brutal of Emilia Clarke? Martin asked Arthur James Hibbard for Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon via Insider. We never discussed it. It made it worse, not better. End quote. If Daenerys was a sex slave, she can't consent. Martin, the man who wrote this, said she did consent. It was a consensual seduction scene, which meant Dany had the freedom to make a choice, something slaves don't have, because Daenerys was not a slave. No one ever says Dany was sold as a slave, because Daenerys was not a slave. I'm about to spend an inordinate amount of time explaining why Daenerys was not a slave. You can skip to the time mark here if you already agree and you don't need it explained to you that Dany was not a literal slave. A few times in this series, it is said Dany was sold to Khal Drogo for the promise of an army, but this is clearly a figure of speech. A variety of characters are mentioned as being bought or sold, but this does not always refer to the literal buying and selling of people. Most times, it's about buying secrets or silence, alliances and allegiances. When Cersei confronts Tyrion about his plan to send Myrcella to the Martells, she says, quote, what a disgusting little worm you are. Myrcella is my only daughter. Do you truly imagine I would allow you to sell her like a bag of oats? End quote. Was Myrcella literally sold like a bag of oats? No. Myrcella was sold to form an alliance between House Lannister and House Martell, the same way Daenerys was sold to Khal Drogo for an army. There was even a previous Daenerys Targaryen that was said to have been sold to Dorne. That was in The Sworn Sword, the first Dunk and Egg novella. Quote, Daeron surrounded himself with maesters, septons, and singers. Always there were women whispering in his ear, and his court was full of Dornishmen. How not when he had taken a Dornish woman into his bed and sold his sweet sister to the Prince of Dorne, though it was Daemon that she loved. End quote. If this is confusing, wait till you hear about bride prices and dowries. Sometimes money and or property is exchanged when real people get married. Is this the literal buying and selling of people? Is all marriage a form of slavery? These are questions for hamsters. The idea that Daenerys Targaryen was a literal slave is a blunt, brutal misinterpretation of the text. This isn't careful analysis. This isn't going over the text with a fine-tooth comb. This is beating the books with a sledgehammer in an attempt to glean their meaning. Anyway, here's what Dany thinks of Magister Illyrio in Book 1. Quote, Magister Illyrio was a dealer in spice, gemstones, dragonbone, and other less savory things. He had friends in all of the 9 free cities, it was said, and even beyond, in Vaes Dothrak and the fabled lands beside the Jade Sea. It was also said that he never had a friend he wouldn't cheerfully sell for the right price. End quote. If Illyrio sells a friend, does that mean he's literally selling a person? No, nay, it just means he betrayed a friend for personal gain. That's what it means to sell someone out. It's a figure of speech. Speaking of which, if someone is telling you Dany was a literal slave, then they are selling you a bill of goods, which means they are serving bullshit. And here at Kevin Pendragon Productions, we are not in the business of serving bullshit. Sold is a figure of speech, but some people, gods be good, don't understand figures of speech. They don't understand metaphors. They think too literally. And that's why this series stays fucking them up. Sold is just a figure of speech. It's just like when Cersei tells Tywin she's the Queen Regent, not some broodmare. Is she actually a horse? No, that's Tyrek Lannister. But if she wasn't a slave, you may ask, then why was she given a slave collar? That heavy golden torque she was given was just jewelry. It was always just jewelry. It was always meant to be jewelry. Magister Illyrio gave her a new silk dress and jewels for her meeting with Drogo. Quote, her brother held up the gown for her inspection. This is beauty. Touch it. Go on. Caress the fabric. Dany touched it. The cloth was so smooth that it seemed to run through her fingers like water. She could not remember ever wearing anything so soft. It frightened her. She pulled her hand away. Is it really mine? A gift from the Magister Illyrio, Viserys said, smiling. Her brother was in a high mood tonight. The color will bring out the violet in your eyes, and you shall have gold as well, and jewels of all sorts. Illyrio has promised. Tonight you must look like a princess. End quote. Later, in the same chapter, Dany has a bath and is dressed for the meeting. Quote, they dressed her in the wisps that Magister Illyrio had sent up, and then the gown, a deep plum silk to bring out the violet in her eyes. The girl slid the gilded sandals onto her feet, while the old woman fixed the tiara in her hair and slid golden bracelets crusted with amethyst around her wrist. Last of all came the collar, a heavy golden torque emblazoned with ancient Valyrian glyphs. End quote. The plum silk dress highlights Dany's violet eyes. The amethysts on the bracelets serve the same purpose. The tiara signifies her status as a royal. The golden collar with the Valyrian glyphs signifies her Valyrian blood. This was all about making Daenerys look like a proper princess, not a prospective bridal sex slave. The golden torque, it's jewelry. Or, I guess the golden collar was a slave collar and the golden bracelets were manacles to bind her hands, and the dress was a slave's dress made by slave labor in a sweatshop in Lice. Only Dany can be given luxurious gifts and her fans will act like she's being oppressed. So what? It is called a collar. Stop thinking literally. It is fucking y'all up. Because Dany was given a silver collar to wear in Book 2, and that was also considered jewelry. Quote, Dany's tight silver collar was chafing against her throat. She unfastened it and flung it aside. The collar was set with an enchanted amethyst that Xaro swore would ward her against all poisons. End quote. Once again, jewelry adorned with amethysts. Why? Because of her purple fucking eyes. But does this collar mean she was Xaro's slave? No, obviously not. So what are we doing? Dany was told Khal Drogo slaves wear golden collars, so she gets a chill from thinking of the torque, because she's just been given something metal to hang around her neck, like an albacore.
Albatrosses.
Dany was not facing literal enslavement, but the similarity of her predicament was close enough that it frightened her. Dany is frightened of everything in her first chapter. Focusing on the torque means you're missing the point. You're missing the haunted forest for the trees. Later, Dany finds out Drogo slaves don't even wear golden collars. They wear bronze collars. That's because a big part of Dany's story in Book 1 is finding out Drogo isn't what she imagined him to be. There's the Drogo she feared before she met him, and then there's the Drogo she fell in love with. Yes, fell in love with. At this point, Dany was not Drogo's bride. She was not even his betrothed. It hadn't been determined if Drogo would be willing to wed her. Why would she be wearing a slave collar before becoming his bridal slave? Tyrion and Jorah don't get their collars until after they are bought by Yezzan Zokagas. Even after she's married to Drogo, Dany never considers herself his slave, and she is never called his slave. Dany never counts herself among the slaves of the Khalasar. Dany acknowledges she was sold to Drogo, a stranger, a barbarian, but she never considers her predicament slavery. No one else calls her predicament slavery, because Daenerys was not a slave. Dany wasn't just afraid of the collar, she was afraid of the dress too. She was scared to touch it. Why was she afraid of the dress? Was it a slave's dress? No, it's because Dany was being dressed up to play a role she really didn't want to play, a role she didn't really know how to play. Quote, "Tonight you must look like a princess." A princess, Dany thought. She had forgotten what that was like. Perhaps she had never really known. End quote. In her very first chapter, Dany was about to do one of the most princess things a princess can do, and that is be used to establish an alliance.
Marcella is my only daughter. Do you really think I'll let you sell her like a common whore?
Marcella's a princess. Some would say she was born for this.
She never grew up with that sort of expectation. She thought she would marry Viserys. All of this princess stuff with the dress and jewels is new and terrifying for her. She wasn't terrified of being a slave. She was terrified of being a Targaryen. Some of you are so worried about the weight of the torque around her neck when you should be worried about the weight she's carrying on her shoulders, the weight of all that legacy. Quote, Dany could hear the singing of the red priests as they lit their night fires and the shouts of ragged children playing games beyond the walls of the estate. For a moment, she wished she could be out there with them, barefoot and breathless and dressed in tatters, with no past and no future and no feast to attend at Khal Drogo's manse. End quote. She doesn't want silks, tiaras, and torques. She doesn't want to be part of a dynasty, which means she has to attend a lavish feast to meet a prospective royal husband. She wants to be no one. Quote, Dany looked at Khal Drogo. His face was hard and cruel, and his eyes cold and dark as onyx. Her brother hurt her sometimes when she woke the dragon, but he did not frighten her the way this man frightened her. I don't want to be his queen, she heard herself say in a small, thin voice. Please, please, Viserys, I don't want to. I want to go home. End quote. Queen, not slave, or, let me guess, Dany is just saying what Viserys wants to hear. She knows she's about to become a slave, but she doesn't want to make Viserys mad by saying so. That makes no damn sense. Daenerys does not want to be a queen. She didn't want to be one in Book 1, and she doesn't really want to be one in Book 5, but y'all are not ready for that conversation. Anyway, the golden torque has Valyrian glyphs on it. We are told this about Khal Drogo. Quote, the Khal only knew a few words of the bastard Valyrian of the Free Cities, and none at all of the common tongue of the Seven Kingdoms. End quote. Khal Drogo doesn't know High Valyrian. Why would Dany be given a slave collar with glyphs Drogo can't read? If the torque was a slave collar, where did it go? It was mentioned once, then never again. Tyrion and Jorah had to have their slave collars removed by a blacksmith. I guess Dany is the only slave in this story that has an optional slave collar. She can put it on and take it off whenever she wants, almost like a piece of jewelry. Weird. Daenerys was not a captive. She was not a prisoner. She was most certainly not a slave. She was a spouse. This symptom does not apply. Dany was a literal slave. What do y'all just be saying? Anything. Slave wear thing around neck? Dany wear thing around neck. Dany must be slave. Such a blunt, brutal misinterpretation of the text. And when I mean blunt and brutal, I mean caveman levels. It's like that meme of Drogon. Mommy dead? Stabby stabby? Chair made of stabby stabby? Chair kill mommy? Me kill chair! Symptom number 2. The captive is held under threat of death or physical injury at the hands of the captor. For 1, Dany wasn't a captive as I just explained. For 2, Daenerys doesn't live under the threat of death, but for a time she did live under the threat of physical injury from Drogo. Dany and Drogo's relationship after they get married is basically non-existent. By day, Drogo straight up ignores Dany. Drogo spends more time hanging with his boys and drinking fermented mare's milk. Meanwhile, Dany is having a terrible time adapting to her new life among the Dothraki. Riding all day is hard on her body. She is not used to it. She goes to bed every night bruised and battered. Or she tries, because nighttime is the only time Drogo actually acknowledges her. On their wedding night, Drogo asked permission and Dany had consensual sex with him. There was foreplay. He takes his time with her until she is comfortable enough to say yes. After that, there was no more asking, no more foreplay. He just comes into their tent and takes her. Drogo relentlessly rides her, leaving her in agony. This, of course, is marital rape. The idea that yes once means yes in perpetuity. The concept does not exist in the world the story takes place in, but there's no way to read this without acknowledging that's exactly what's happening here. The harsh riding by day and Drogo's assaults by night leave Dany wanting to die by suicide. So yes, symptom number 2 applies here, as it did with Theon. But, as with Theon, we are not done yet. Symptom number 3. The inability of the captive to engage in behaviors that may assist in their release or detachment. Dany's behavior isn't regulated by Drogo. During the day, when Drogo is hanging with his homies, Dany is left to her own devices. Sometimes she eats with her brother and Ser Jorah. Sometimes she eats alone, which is quite sad. Her ability to socialize isn't controlled by Drogo. She's free to do as she will. She can talk to her handmaid and slaves or her brother and Ser Jorah. She has the ability to ride ahead of the Khalasar to explore. We don't see Drogo give her his permission to do that. She doesn't do it in defiance of her status as a captive. She does it because she wants to. She does it because she has the power to do so. She's Drogo's queen.
Not a queen. A Khaleesi.
I stand corrected. George R.R. Martin says that Dany blooms on the Dothraki Sea, and her making these decisions is part of her blooming. It's part of her coming into power. Her story in Book 1 is about power. That's according to George R.R. Martin, the man who wrote this. So many interpretations of Daenerys I've come across paint her as this passive victim. She has no power and no agency. Is anyone else tired of the word agency? Dany is far from passive, but there's a reason why some people present her as the ultimate victim, and we will talk about that later in this video. Dany's ability to escape or detach isn't inhibited, and that's because she's not a captive looking to escape. She's a wife living with her husband. Dany doesn't even believe she's trapped. There's a moment in Book 1 when Dany is reflecting on her life as Khaleesi, and she comes to the conclusion that it's not enough. Her life cannot be confined to the Dothraki Sea and Drogo's Khalasar. She was meant for much more than that. Quote, "If I were not the blood of the dragon," she thought wistfully, "this could be my home." She was Khaleesi. She had a strong man and a swift horse, handmaids to serve her, warriors to keep her safe, an honored place in the Dosh Khaleen awaiting her when she grew old, and in her womb grew a son who would one day bestride the world. That should be enough for any woman, but not for the dragon. With Viserys gone, she was the last, the very last. She was the seed of kings and conquerors, and so too the child inside her. She must not forget. End quote. In this moment, when Daenerys is being incredibly introspective, she does not consider herself to be a slave. She considers herself a Khaleesi. She considers Drogo her protector, not her captor. She does not feel hopeless, helpless, or trapped. When Shorty is ready to dip, Shorty is going to dip. This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 4. The smallest act of kindness or lack of violence from the captor elicits feelings of sympathy from the captive. This is the symptom where we are supposed to see Drogo's abusive behavior toward Dany change, but it never does. The only violence Drogo perpetrated upon Dany were his nightly visits to her tent, where he roughly rode her. He was not physically abusive to her otherwise. His treatment of her during their sexual encounters never changes, because later, after her dragon dream, we are told, quote, she began to find pleasure even in her nights, and if she still cried out when Drogo took her, it was not always in pain, end quote. He is still relentlessly riding her. It's just after that dragon dream, she can't endure it. She even likes it sometimes, even after she becomes pregnant. Quote, Dany tired more easily as the child within her grew. In truth, a night of rest would be most welcome. Her pregnancy only seemed to have inflamed Drogo's desire for her, and of late, his embraces have left her exhausted. End quote. Drogo does nothing to make Dany start to think maybe the relentless riding will stop. Instead, we are told her pregnancy actually makes him more aggressive in bed. This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 5, a self-preservation instinct on the part of the prisoner. The victim learns to avoid triggers that will set off their captor. This is the symptom where the prisoner learns to walk on eggshells around their captor. Daenerys never adopts such behavior with Drogo. This symptom does not apply. Symptom number 6, negative feelings by the victim towards family, friends, or authorities trying to help them or support the victim. Daenerys only has one friend in Book 1, and that's Ser Jorah, and he's not even her friend in the beginning. He's actively betraying her at the time. Sure, she is cool with her slaves and her guards, but they aren't really her friends either. Daenerys only has one family member that she knows of in Book 1, and that's Viserys, and he's an abusive monster. Ser Jorah only tries to get Dany to leave Drogo after it became clear Drogo was going to die. Dany doesn't lash out at him in response. She doesn't think Ser Jorah should just go away, that he should mind his business and leave her alone. You don't know him like I do. That sort of thing. She doesn't have negative feelings for Jorah for trying to help her. This symptom does not apply. Alright, assessment done. As with Theon, only one of the 6 symptoms fits Daenerys' case, so it would be safe to say that Dany does not have Stockholm Syndrome. But if her story is not about a young girl that fell in love with her captor despite his abuse, what is it about then? Chapter 5. What is Dany's story all about then? While I don't have the time to explain Dany's entire story here, that would take a much longer video, I mean huge, I can explain her arc in Book 1 at least. Dany's story in Book 1 is the story of a young girl rising to meet great challenges, all while being burdened by the weight of an impossible legacy. It is also your classic tale of the weak becoming strong. It's about power. When we first meet her, Dany is timid, intractable. She has very little confidence. She is unable to stand up for herself. She is sold into a life she does not want. At the start of the series, Dany is one of the least powerful characters. But with time, she finds an inner strength. Her dragon awakens. She goes from princess to Khaleesi to queen. She becomes the mother of dragons. She leads her own Khalasar. She went from needing a protector to becoming one. Power. In the beginning, the daily rides with the Dothraki left Dany feeling sore all over. The nightly visits by Drogo only compounded her pain. Dany was in such dire straits, she wanted to end her own life. But after her dragon dream, Dany taps into a power she never knew she had. One thing Dany does when she begins to come into her power is make Khal Drogo submit to her. In a way, Dany is topping Drogo, both literally and God damn it. Both literally and figuratively. She's physically on top of him, pinning him down, which is a display of dominance. And as she is on top of him, she makes Drogo her bottom, riding him so relentlessly he submits to her, calling out her name in ecstasy. This is a moment of power. Yes, bottoms can have power. I've watched several documentaries on the topic. Removing the element of love, suggesting this night was just another night where Dany had to endure more sexual abuse, makes no sense because this is the night she and Drogo made Rhaego. If you stop thinking literally, this is a story, and in this story, a character just rose to meet a challenge. She was successful, which means that character should be rewarded. What is her reward? A damn baby. Dany looks back on this night fondly. Honestly and truly, if you're reading these scenes and you're like, Oh my god, she has to carry her abuser's baby? She thinks she's in love because of Stockholm Syndrome? She should be looking for moon tea. Like, this is fiction. The text never presents any of this as a tragedy. If you think this way, give me your books. You do not deserve them. The poor, poor trees. I spent so much time writing this portion of the script trying to explain why this is just fiction and Dany actually loved Drogo that I ended up with 60 extra pages. Those pages became a completely separate video coming soon because I am so tired of the people in this fandom that lack nuance, that interpret everything literally, the people that don't accept the moral ambiguity of this fictional world, the ones that go on and on about how Dany is just 14 years old. We know! At the start of book 1, Dany was sold off to a great beast of a man who she thought would do her harm. Her brother was abusive, and she feared this stranger would be even worse. Over time, she discovered her husband was no beast at all. The true beast had been her brother all along.
He's no monster, Gaston. You are.
If someone wanted to make the case that Daenerys has Stockholm Syndrome, the better fit is obviously to say Dany got it from Viserys, not from Drogo. I still wouldn't believe it, but it would make for a better theory. Throughout book 1, he's the one that abuses her while she does everything she can to try and please him. He's the one she tries to change, but her attempts never work. He's the one that has her walking on eggshells in fear of waking the dragon. She fears him, but she still loves him because despite all of the abuse, she remembers his small acts of kindness, letting her sleep in his bed when she was young and scared, telling her stories of their family and the lore of dragons. He was kind to her, but he still hurt her as well. And after Viserys was gone, Dany found something of a home with her husband. Genuine love blossomed between them. She could have settled on the Dothraki Sea with her son and her sun and stars, but she determined that wouldn't have been enough. The life of a Khaleesi, privileged as it was, could never be enough. Not for the dragon. Dany yearns for a place to call home, but she also thinks she must claim the Iron Throne. Dany will always be deeply unhappy trying to achieve both goals because it's impossible. This is the human heart at conflict with itself. Not Stockholm Syndrome, because Stockholm Syndrome is goofy and it isn't even real. Chapter 6, Stockholm Syndrome isn't even real. Uh-oh. Plot twist. And I quote, well, not me reading the quote, but here's a quote.
The world was quick to embrace, without question, an explanation that the Swedish hostages had essentially fallen under the spell of their attackers. There was little mention of the days spent under siege by inept police, the hostages' first-hand experiences of authorities' mistakes, or the fact that Niels Begerot never even treated Ms. Enmark. Nor was there a discussion about whether Miss Enmark's reactions were simply nuanced, when others expected a black-and-white response to a hero and villain story that wasn't as simplistic as it seemed. Women have historically been diagnosed from afar by male psychiatrists with a number of bogus disorders. It's hard to believe that sexism didn't affect the claims of Stockholm Syndrome.
Not only do Theon and Dany fail to exhibit the known symptoms associated with the alleged condition, the condition isn't even real. Stockholm Syndrome is not a diagnosable mental illness. It is not in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, nor is it in the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases. I probably should have led with that. But then I wouldn't get any of that sweet, sweet ad revenue from watch time. I only make videos for money. This is a grift. That's why I make so many videos. To quote an article from The Independent titled, "What is Stockholm Syndrome?" the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, doesn't define Stockholm Syndrome at all. It's never met the strict review requirements to be included. In fact, it seems that no one ever submitted it for inclusion in the first place. That means there are no identified diagnostic criteria at all for the alleged condition. End quote. Not only does diagnosing these fictional characters miss the point of what Martin is trying to do, Stockholm Syndrome isn't even a thing. Stockholm Syndrome is so over, even Cracked.com did a new article saying it isn't even real. When you get into the details of how Stockholm Syndrome even came to be, it's hard to believe that anyone still takes it seriously. Remember Kristen Inmark, one of the hostages in the Stockholm incident? She was the most critical of the police out of all the hostages. She later met with one of her captors and is rumored to have slept with one while a hostage in the bank. Well, her seemingly bizarre behavior is what piqued,
but at this point my interest was fully piqued,
the interest of psychologist Niels Bejerot. For her to have a sexual relationship with a man holding her hostage, Niels Bejerot concluded something must be psychologically wrong with Miss Inmark. The only reason she could sleep with her captor and damn the police for trying to save her is because she was deeply troubled. Something about the incident fundamentally changed her way of thinking and behaving. She is the reason why he invented Norman-Story Syndrome. I tried. I did my best. I tried. So Niels Bejerot created Stockholm Syndrome based on Kristen Inmark's behavior. Niels Bejerot never met Kristen Inmark. He never met her, not even once. After the incident was over, Kristen Inmark reported that the police made her fear for her life due to their largely ineffectual tactics in trying to rescue her and her co-workers. Hostage negotiation back then isn't what it is today. Law enforcement was making it up as they went along. Their bumbling antics often made Kristen's captors angry, which in turn made them aggressive toward the hostages. Kristen never felt like her captors intentionally wanted to harm her. It was the police that provoked them to anger. So if the captors did do something to hurt them, the police would be to blame. Kristen feared the police would get everyone killed with their rampant stupidity. For example, the situation in Stockholm originally started with just one criminal. He went to the bank with a gun and took Kristen and her co-workers hostage. The police weren't sure who the criminal was. They just knew some guy had taken people hostage at a bank. Eventually, they were able to come up with a name, Kaj Hansen. So they tracked down Kaj's brother with the hope he could assist them in the ordeal. An officer and Kaj's brother approached the bank to speak with the criminal Kaj. Now, did you write down the name I told you at the beginning of the video? I told you it would be important. What name do you have? Is it Kaj Hansen? No, it's Jan Erik Olsen. Kaj Hansen was a completely different man. When Jan Erik Olsen saw a police officer and some random dude that was not his brother approaching the bank, guess what he did?
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang!
I've also read it wasn't a cop that went to the bank with the brother but Niels Bejerot himself. Either way, Jan Erik Olsen said absolutely not. Luckily, no one was hurt, but this is the sort of incompetence that made Kristen Inmark think. Now here's something funny. When Kaj Hansen saw in a newspaper that he was being blamed for robbing a bank, he called the police to clear up the matter. He said, actually, that's not me, because I'm in Hawaii. The thing is, Kaj Hansen was a wanted criminal at the time. The police were looking for him, and he just gave them his exact location. So law enforcement in Hawaii found him, arrested him, and sent his ass back to Sweden. If Kaj didn't have a record, I'd say he should have applied to be a Swedish cop. He's got the brains for it. Anywho, Kristen had the chance to speak with the Swedish Prime Minister over the phone during her captivity. He tried to explain to her that the brother thing was a big mistake and that the police were trying to find Olsen's real brother to help. Exasperated, she had to explain, no, don't do that. Why? Because Olsen said he would shoot his own brother if they brought him to the bank. Did the Prime Minister listen? No. Kristen made her concerns very clear. She was talking to the Prime Minister after all. Who else better to help her? She did not want to die in that bank because of the police. In response, the Prime Minister told her if the police did accidentally kill her while trying to rescue her, then she should feel honored to have died at her post. I think if someone says, hey, you should be happy you might get killed at work, it's an honor, I think you get to be a little mad at them afterwards. When Kristen Inmark starts shit-talking the police after she's rescued, Niels Bejerot straight up didn't believe anything she had to say. Rather than believe a woman, he thought she must be mentally ill. A man not believing a woman.
Tale as old as time.
Kristen Inmark's negative comments about law enforcement actually gained traction in the media, and she developed a negative reputation with the public. A woman getting hate from the public because she spoke the truth?
Tale as old as...
Listen, I won't sit here and even try to pretend to be an expert on these sorts of issues, but in doing research for this video, it made me think of Anita Hill, Amber Heard, the Dixie Chicks, and other such cases, and I was like, well, I'm no expert, but this sure does happen often. Weird.
All this has happened before, and it will all happen again.
Psychiatrist Niels Bejerot planned to use this case to boost his career. That's why he made a big deal of announcing this new syndrome. He was going to ruin a woman's life to better his own. I think when you lay down the details of the case and look at everything, I would say Stockholm Syndrome bad? Stockholm Syndrome suggests a weakness on the part of the victim, that they were somehow psychologically vulnerable to a form of mental manipulation, mind control, brainwashing. They didn't put up a fight. They succumbed to the syndrome. The truth is that Kristen Inmark took charge in that credit banking. When one of her co-workers revealed they were claustrophobic, Kristen convinced the captors to move them all to a bigger space. She did the majority of communication with outside law enforcement. Her goal was to get everyone out alive. Law enforcement, meanwhile, seemed to think casualties were to be expected. This is why Kristen Inmark was so moist critical of the police.
And they're slitting the throat of the hostages. Jinkies. Hey, prayers to the families.
Alan Wade, in his presentation called The Myth of Stockholm Syndrome, writes, quote, as a 23-year-old woman, Kristen showed extraordinary presence of mind and determination throughout the ordeal, not infantile regression, end quote. Kristen Inmark was not a baby. She was anything but weak. She didn't resist good help. She just couldn't find any. Kristen Inmark didn't succumb to a syndrome. She adopted a survival strategy. If befriending her captors increased her chances of making it out of that bank alive, then so be it. That's what she would do. Olsen and Olofsson, the hostage takers, were reportedly frustrated by the cooperation of Kristen and her co-workers. It was hard for them to think of harming the hostages because the hostages had managed to befriend them. Kristen set the example they all followed. When the original captor walked in that bank on the 23rd of August, 1973, a cutscene initiated for Kristen Inmark. She knew what her objective must be: survive. But what if Martin wrote in Stockholm Syndrome before it was disregarded as pseudoscience? It can be fake in life but still be a real story element. This is fiction after all. If that's the case, he did a poor job of it. Theon Greyjoy is a character that has endured childhood trauma that has stayed with him long into adulthood. Aeron is a victim of child sex abuse. Martin leaves clues regarding this in Aeron's very first chapter in Book 4. Quote, Aeron closed his eyes and said a silent prayer, and after a while began to drowse in the saddle. The sound came softly, the scream of a rusted hinge. Yuri, he muttered, and woke, fearful. There is no hinge, no door, no Yuri. End quote. Aeron struggles to sleep for fear of remembering that trauma. It was not until a sample chapter from Book 6 was released that the source of the trauma was revealed. Aeron and his brother Uragon were repeatedly raped by their elder brother Euron. Aeron and Uragon were in their early teens and Euron was in his mid-20s when the assaults occurred. On certain nights, Euron would get drunk and visit Aeron and Uragon's bedchamber. The sound of a rusty hinge haunts Aeron's mind, the sound of his old bedchamber door opening as Euron entered. He's not the only one with this kind of trauma. John Connington is haunted by the sound of the bells following his defeat at Stony Sept. The town rang its bells to warn its citizens to stay inside while the Baratheon rebels fought the Targaryen loyalists. Aeron and Jon Conn's trauma manifest in ways that are understandable to all readers. even those that might not be familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. But what Martin doesn't do is plant any seeds of doubt in the reader's mind that Dany loved Drogo. Dany never thinks to herself, I love Drogo, but... And because Daenerys never doubts it, the reader has no reason to doubt it either. You can't read her chapters and then go, oh, well, he abused her, and according to what I know about domestic violence, no, that's not how it works. This is fiction. We can determine the author's intent by the clues or lack thereof in the story. Are there any clues that Dany's love for Drogo is not genuine? Did George R.R. Martin want to use Dany as an example as a case of Stockholm Syndrome? Or did you read about Stockholm Syndrome? You heard it was this thing where abuse victims fall in love with their abusers. You read Dany fall in love with someone that once hurt her, so you decided to apply Stockholm Syndrome to her case. That's not how this works. So here's a post I found on Reddit that also makes a case against the Stockholm Syndrome theory. The conclusion, I think, is very fitting. Quote, my main argument against the Stockholm Syndrome theory is that it's used to get Martin off the hook for writing said fucked up relationship as, unironically, romantic. I'm maintaining the text posits the relationship is healthy and that is beyond fucking weird. End quote. And this person is 100% right. It is weird. The weirdness doesn't come from any reader's interpretation. It comes from Martin. And as this person says, calling this Stockholm Syndrome gives Martin a pass. In an interview with Glamour magazine, actress Emilia Clarke, known as the star of Marvel's Secret Invasion, shared her opinions on the Dany and Drogo romance. She said, quote, Daenerys and Khal Drogo's arranged marriage and the customary that followed. Ask George R.R. Martin why he did that, cause that's on him. But, she continued, I thought the consensual sex she has thereafter was genius. She is physically saying, you can't me again. I'm going to be in control and show you something you've never seen before. End quote. Even Emilia Clarke says the rape stuff is all on Martin. And it is. She also agreed Dany and Drogo's relationship was consensual thereafter. What the Stockholm Syndrome theory does, it makes everything okay for people that like Dany's story, but they don't like the ickiness of her loving a man like Drogo. Did a 14-year-old fall in love with the much older man she was sold to, the same one that hurt her? No, she got syndromed. So anytime Dany thinks of Drogo in a loving way, these people can tell themselves, this isn't happening, this isn't real. The problem isn't the material, the problem is other people and their interpretations of the material. Other people are wrong for thinking Dany loved Drogo. That did not happen. This allows them to keep reading a story they are morally opposed to. As this person on Reddit says, it's pure copium. I find that a lot of analysis of Dany that I find here on YouTube and in other places, it's just pure copium. It's a fierce denial of things that Daenerys has done and dishonest attempts at defending her from things she might do in the future. I tend to walk away from these essays where people passionately defend Daenerys with the impression that they don't actually like her, which is odd. Because in their attempts to defend her, in their attempt to tell you who the real Daenerys actually is, they deny so many aspects of her character. You don't have to like that she loved Drogo, but she loved him. She still does. The text makes that very clear without a shadow of a doubt. To deny that she loves him, to deny her feelings, and say that she's your favorite character is quite odd to me. To quote Daenerys Targaryen from A Storm of Swords, Khal Drogo could be cruel as well, and there was never a man more dangerous. She had come to love him all the same. End quote. Chapter 7. True Victims of Ice and Fire. Stockholm Syndrome was never meant to be captive falls in love with their captor. It was a very specific condition that was believed to arise when people in hostage situations show sympathy for the person or persons that have taken them hostage. For my research on this video, I ended up reading a book called See What You Made Me Do by Jess Hill. It documented many cases of domestic abuse. It also covers Stockholm Syndrome and how its introduction into psychology and criminology made it even more difficult for female victims of domestic abuse to be believed. Stockholm Syndrome was not something that helped female victims of crime and domestic violence. It hurt them. Because if a victim did not present as a true victim, their claims of abuse were less likely to be believed. A true victim is described in the book as, quote, a middle-aged, working-class white woman, a good mother, and a devoted wife who has done everything in her power to appease her abuser and obtain protection from the criminal justice system. End quote. If a victim did not possess all or some of the qualities of a true victim, if they used drugs, went back to their abuser, or was not white, then their claims of abuse would be viewed as lacking credibility. Jess Hill goes on to say, quote, victims were typecast as pure, timid, and submissive, the proverbial woman cowering in the corner. End quote. I find this to be disturbingly similar to how Daenerys Targaryen is often discussed. In her book, Jess Hill goes on to say, quote, unless a victim's story matches the standard drama of a virtuous female protagonist and a one-dimensional male villain, the legal system often doesn't know what to do with her. End quote. It would appear even some readers of fictional stories don't know what to do with such cases either, which is why Dany's story is reduced to she was an underage bridal sex slave. Drogo was her abusive slave master. This is also one-dimensional. It's as if these people don't or can't understand Daenerys and her story, so they have to simplify it into something that's easier for them to comprehend. Daenerys is recast as the proverbial girl cowering in the corner, Drogo the savage slave master. In defense of Daenerys, many are unknowingly playing into outdated stereotypes of what the perfect domestic violence victim is supposed to look like. Which is why Dany's power is either downplayed or disavowed, and the nature of her victimhood is exaggerated. Sometimes aspects of her abuse are outright fabricated. Essentially, Daenerys is crafted into a true victim. I don't think the people that characterize Dany as a true victim realize what they're doing. I think they believe they are defending her, trying to shield her from criticism. Really, they are diminishing her. And in doing so, they are playing into misogynistic tropes. I tend to notice a lot of misogyny coming from Dany fans. Usually, this misogyny is directed toward other female characters, Sansa Stark being a prime example. But it would seem Dany's most ardent supporters have hurt themselves in the confusion. Using Stockholm Syndrome to defend Dany? Yikes. This ain't it, Chief. It's actually rooted in sexism and misogyny. These people, they recast Dany as a true victim because, in their minds, she's never done anything wrong, and she will never do anything wrong. These are the people that approach the material with zero nuance. Moral ambiguity does not exist for them. Characters are good or they are bad, and to them, Daenerys Targaryen is good. She is the true victim of a song of ice and fire. Conclusion. Let's wrap this up. Post-production Pendragon here. I just wanted to chime in and say, I don't think Theon has Stockholm Syndrome with Ramsay either. Stockholm Syndrome is not a device that's at play in any character story. It's not in these books. Throw it away. People that write these theories act as if they've made some profound discovery when, no, they just misinterpreted the media they consumed. They turned it into something it was never meant to be. They are more concerned with the appearance of being clever than they are with actually engaging with the material in any meaningful way. Like this quote about Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is not a love story. It's a 3-day relationship between a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old that resulted in 6 deaths. Sincerely, everyone who actually read it. Oh, bloody hell. You know, I consider myself a writer, even though I spend more time writing scripts for these videos than I do working on my own personal projects.
No, Kevin, I love you. No one works harder than this man. Do you know that every morning Kevin wakes up at 4 a.m. to make a shitty movie?
As a writer and as someone who enjoys reading and watching fiction, character had the syndrome theories almost always comes across as this M. Night Shyamalan style twist. Like the theory that goes, all the Rugrats are dead. Angelica is only imagining them because she is lonely. Or the theory, Winnie the Pooh characters each represent a different mental illness. Winnie has an eating disorder. Owl has short-term memory loss. Eeyore has depressive disorder. Same. Tigger has ADHD. Same. But is that what we're meant to think? That Winnie has an ED? That Christopher Robin has schizophrenia? That Tommy Pickles is dead?
What happened? What happened?
he discovered his own mortality. No, that's not the point of those stories. Those are just fan theories. Basically, they're fan fiction. But I'm not completely unsympathetic to some people that think Dany has Stockholm Syndrome. I think some people feel there is something missing from the romance, which is why they fill in the blanks with this so-called syndrome. We jump from Dany wanting to end her own life to a dragon dream, then suddenly she loves Drogo. The dream is supposed to be her leveling up. You know how people are told to grow a thicker skin if they want to survive in this world? Dany's skin literally gets thicker after the dragon dream. Dany wakes up stronger than she was yesterday. Now it's nothing but her way. Suddenly, her loneliness isn't killing her anymore. You can't contribute that to a syndrome. It's Martin doing magical hand-waving. He speeds run through Dany's early time with the Dothraki. He's not interested in telling how Dany learned how to ride, or how Dany and Drogo fell in love. There's a lot of expediency in book 1. The book really moves at a clip. If Martin was writing those chapters now, she'd still be in Vase Dothrak. Shit, she might still be in Pentos.
Anyway.
Also, I do not speak Spanish. I just like saying pobrecito. I have one abuela and she did not teach me shit.
Eso no es my fault.
Martin expects readers to understand Dany got over the difficulties early in her marriage. She adapted. He's not asking you to accept it. He's expecting you to understand it. So the question isn't, does Dany have Stockholm Syndrome? The real question is, did George R.R. Martin write a believable romance between Daenerys and Drogo? If your answer is no, then this has nothing to do with Dany having Stockholm Syndrome. This is about your suspension of disbelief. You are allowed to believe the writing has failed in some way. You don't have to like the story. However, you are not allowed to add elements to the story that the writer himself did not intend to be there and then act like you discovered it. All because you don't believe this relationship was morally acceptable. Some stories aren't written to cater to your personal morals and values. And that's about it. I think I covered everything. I know someone will be like, you don't get it because you can't read between the lines. You don't get it because you need everything spelled out for you. Sure, keep believing Dany was a literal slave. Keep talking about that slave collar that vanishes after the chapter where it's introduced. Keep thinking she didn't really love Drogo. Keep believing she had Stockholm Syndrome. Keep believing Theon had the syndrome. The syndrome that was determined to be based on bad science. The syndrome that isn't considered to be real. Anyway, in my opinion, saying a character has Stockholm Syndrome isn't even a brilliant observation. Honestly, I think Lindsay Ellis said it best.
Your uninformed observation does not make you smarter than the media you consume. It just means you're not paying attention. And that is why the whole Stockholm Syndrome thing is stupid and needs to go away.
I agree. Thank you if you made it this far. I hope you all enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. I absolutely do not care if you think Dany, Theon, or the genie from Aladdin actually have Stockholm Syndrome.
Hell, let's armchair diagnose everyone. Everyone has Stockholm Syndrome. The genie has Stockholm Syndrome because he's so loyal to his kind master. After all, Aladdin's not like Jafar. He's one of the nice ones, you know. He'll unslave you after you do him a few favors.
Save him and I will free you, I swear it.
Oh, that's not...
In the sense that...
I don't care if you think the Rugrats are dead. Thank you to the following Patreon supporters and channel members, including Daniel, Philip E., and Jessica P. You can become one too for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to fellow A Song of Ice and Fire YouTubers Meera Reads and Random Internet Guy. You can find links to their content in the description below. When I'm not writing scripts for really long video essays on this channel, you can find me on my second channel, Mad King Kevin, also talking about A Song of Ice and Fire news in a more casual way. All of my older discussion videos are on that channel, including some videos that were exclusive to Patreon supporters and channel members. This is the part of the video where I sell myself. Oh no. Again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Honestly, this video essay stuff is easy when you use other people's work. I should do it more often.